Okay, for part of today's lecture, I want to make sure that we go back and take a look at this. This is one of the big differences between the colonies, and I told you guys all along we've been kind of hinting at the differences between these regional differences between the colonies, New England colonies, the middle colonies, and then the southern colonies. And one of the biggest differences, of course, is the institutionalization of race-based slavery in the southern colonies. So this section in chapter 3, you need to pay attention to very carefully. Make sure that you watch the author video in your textbook to give you kind of an oversight. Remember that the system that we are talking about here is this idea of race-based slavery, an institution that uses racial characteristics and myths to justify enslaving people by force, okay, through the force of law in our case. Slavery has been around for a long time. Okay, the ancient Greeks enslaved people based on debt. Okay, the Egyptians enslaved people. Okay, slavery has been around for a long time, but this is a system that is based on really the origins of people. They're from Africa. They have the African skin tone, and so that is where we start to see this institutionalized slavery begin to show up. Okay, so remember that this starts with Africa. Okay, and a lot of people kind of have this idea that Africa was not very civilized at this time, and that's wrong. Okay, there were several different kingdoms. They had really several. They spoke hundreds of different languages. Okay, so it's not just some barren place full of uncivilized peoples. That's just not true. But they are taken advantage of by the Europeans, and Virginia, Maryland, and those states that begin to import slaves will begin to import them from Africa. And remember, this doesn't start with the Americans. Okay, this begins really with the Portuguese making contact with Africa in the late 1300s, early 1400s or so. And of course, the Spanish continue the process as well after the Columbian Exchange wipes out the Native Americans. So here they talk a little bit about the tech, and I've kind of talked to you about a little bit about this. All right, that slaves were imported based on characteristics. Virginia and Maryland brought over slaves from a particular area in West Africa because they were farmers, and the farming work they did there was similar to what they did with tobacco. And I told you about South Carolinians importing slaves from a particular area where rice was grown because they knew how to farm rice, and they had a little bit of a resistance to the the malaria that mosquitoes carried. So when you're farming rice in very wet conditions, that can be very troublesome. All right, so if you look here, it gives you some statistics, and I want to make sure that you guys know this. Okay, that in 1750, the vast majority of slaves were in Virginia and Maryland. Okay, about 60,000 in South Carolina. Okay, so most of the slaves in Virginia, Maryland, you're talking over 200,000 slaves. Okay, and there were about 33,000 in the northern colonies. So you're talking about 300,000 imported Africans, imported slaves in 1750. Okay, so and I told you guys that slavery in the North did exist. Okay, especially in the cities where you had domestic servants. Basically, many of those roles were filled by slaves. Okay, but in the South, most of those slaves were doing agricultural labor, and very difficult agricultural labor as well. Make sure that you also understand the idea of the slave code. Okay, that slave codes are basically laws passed by a colony to regulate slavery, and that means it becomes a legalized institution. Okay, it's been recognized by law, and therefore it becomes an institutionalized form of slavery. The slave codes really put the Africans, the imported Africans, into a very bad, a very disadvantaged system. They couldn't sue. They were viewed as property. They couldn't. They had no legal standing. All right, so it makes it very difficult for them, and of course they have no civil rights as well. The runaways did happen, but because of the slave codes, which punished runaway slaves so brutally, right, it was a very difficult situation if you got caught. Some were beaten, and of course beaten very severely. Others would have a limb amputated to prevent them from running away again. Okay, so sometimes they were beaten until they were dead, right, to serve as an example of what you don't want to do. And that, of course, is all viewed by the legal system as okay because of the slave codes. We also talked a little bit about why don't the slaves revolt, and in some cases they do. The most famous is the Stono Rebellion. Okay? In 1739, a slave uprising in South Carolina happened. The slaves took weapons. They were trying to get to Florida. They were trying to get to Spanish territory. They were trying to escape. Okay, and along the way, they end up having to fight for their freedom. They end up killing several men, and then eventually they are all captured by a posse that's sent out to round them up, and they're killed. Okay, so more than 60 were captured, cut off their heads, and set them in every milepost. Okay, brutal, brutal. All right, situation. This was the biggest fear for slave owners, was a rebellion. And so that's why you see some of these very brutal punishments to dissuade that type of rebellion. Okay. So I want to kind of make sure that we went over that part. The last thing I'm going to talk about is a religious uprising that happens here in America. And it goes along with also the Enlightenment, the stirrings of the Enlightenment in Europe as well. So we kind of have two things going on here. Okay, in Europe, and about this time, all right, the late 1600s, early 1700s, there's something going on called the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. The Scientific Revolution began to challenge what we sort of believed about science, about the universe around us, about us. And what we found out is that our knowledge about some of these things is pretty lacking. And so the Scientific Revolution exposed a lot of flaws in our thinking. On the heels of that came the Enlightenment, where educated, they're called philosophes in France, right? The educated elite began to challenge some of the other things that we may not know about, including government. What's the best form of government? What should we, what should be the best form of government? And what they began to do is they began to analyze government, economics, whatever you want to talk about here, society, okay, scientifically, all right? And you all know the scientific method, all right? And so they began to tear down some of these long-held beliefs about what really was the best form of government. And this began in the cities, and especially in Europe, and then spread, and it spreads here to America. So make sure you watch this video here about the Enlightenment in America, okay? One of the biggest things about the Enlightenment is it challenges what we think about government. It exposes certain things, and we start to think about really what our rights are, okay? So one of the things that you talk about and you hear is that this age is called the age of reason, okay? So it's triggered by the scientific revolution, and the climax of which, by the way, was Isaac Newton. And you know how important Isaac Newton is. Newton was so brilliant that he would basically become, he did a lot of work with light and prisms and physics, the physics of light. But he became so really interested in some of the things that were going on in other parts of the scientific revolution that he began to tackle some of those problems. He essentially locked himself in his room for a while and developed what is today the calculus. Newtonian calculus is different than what you use in your calculus class today, but calculus, he needed the math to come up with the proof of what he believed the way the universe worked. And you've all kind of grown up knowing about Newton's three laws of motion. Force equals mass times acceleration. Object at rest stays at rest. Object in motion stays in motion in a straight line, unless acted on by an outside force. Okay, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Right, those three laws of motion sort of form the beginnings, really, of the Newtonian universe. And he needed the math to also come up with the capstone of which is gravity. Okay, that every object in the universe attracts every other object in the universe. All right, and so gravity is the force that's out there that is ordering the universe. That's big stuff. Okay, and it has repercussions everywhere, including here. One of the big things that will happen is many of the people who are part of the Enlightenment, who are part of the scientific revolution, become deists. Okay, and the definition of deism is here. Basically, deists believed that God existed, that there was a God. Okay, God, there had to be a God to order the universe, and there had to be a God to put all this structure together. But God is a remote God. God set the universe into motion, and then he left it alone. And so it works on its own because it is a rational, reasonable universe governed by laws. So deists believe that God set everything into motion and it just works. God doesn't intervene. There's no such thing as miracles. Okay. So you were responsible for essentially, basically being good, but God is not going to intervene. Okay. The prayer, organized religion, all of those things are worthless because God's not going to intervene. Deists, though, is freed them from being, well, really what it allowed them to do is to believe in a God, but continue to do their scientific work. The most famous of these, I mean, Ben Franklin, all right, Thomas Jefferson's considered to be a deist. Many of the early American thinkers were deists, okay? And a lot of these guys are intrigued by not only the science of the time, but also some of the Enlightenment principles that are coming out. Best example is this right here, John Locke. Okay, John Locke, in really in about 1692, wrote two treatises of government. Okay, basically two essays about government. And what had happened in England was the Glorious Revolution had happened, and the English had signed the English Bill of Rights, creating the constitutional monarchy in England. Big deal. England is still a constitutional monarchy. Okay, Parliament governs England, but there's still a monarch in place. John Locke felt that this was the best form of government. I told you Enlightenment thinkers are trying to parse out what the best form of government is. And Locke believed that this was the best one. And so he writes two essays about government, supporting what the English have done. One of the most important things that he talks about in this two treatises on government are the natural rights. Okay, that you are born with certain natural rights. Locke calls them life, liberty, and property. You're going to see that again. Okay, John Locke is very influential on Jefferson and Franklin. And later on, it's kind of ironic that both of those guys end up on a committee that's going to write a Declaration of Independence that talks about inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Franklin is fascinating. Okay, Franklin is probably our greatest Enlightenment thinker. Okay, and he is an inventor. He is a thinker. He is a writer. He is an all-around scientific guy. Okay, so some of his accomplishments. Okay, you can read here: founded a public library, started a fire company. Okay, organized debating clubs, developed different types of lenses, including bifocals. Okay, so the Franklin stove, the lightning rod, all right, anything else you can think of. All right, Franklin loved science, but he also was very reasonable. Okay, and he's a great example of deism in America and a great example of the Enlightenment thinkers. Okay, now that's the Enlightenment. Okay, that's reason and science. At roughly the same time in Europe, you get this, the Great Awakening. Okay, between 1700 1750, when the Enlightenment is brewing, where the scientific revolution is going on, where deism is becoming popular with enlightened thinkers, you have this religious movement that breaks out among Christians. That's called the Great Awakening. Okay, it is it's very Christian. It is very almost fundamentalist in some ways, and it is extremely emotional. Okay, it is based on really the beginnings of evangelism. Okay, so you have these guys that get caught up in the Great Awakening. Okay, especially in the early 1700s, and it is really a movement of intense revivalism. Okay, it starts in Europe, it's going to spread here. Okay, and the Great Awakening is this really super intense, all right, revivalism that begins to spread across America. It starts in the South, goes to New England. Okay, and you would have these traveling preachers who would come. They were charismatic, they were great speakers. Okay, and they were caught up really in this emotionalism of the Great Awakening. Okay, it is, as this points out here. Okay, and a lot of people have talked about this. Okay, that the Great Awakening may be the first movement in America that affects all 13 colonies. And so it may be one of the things that helps, in the beginning at least, string these colonies together. I've told you guys in class, and I've emphasized that these colonies were very different from one another. But here you have the Great Awakening that applies and appeals to all of them. Okay, and a lot of people talk about this, that this is one of the most important sort of movements in pre-revolutionary America because it helps bring the colonies together. There's some great examples. Your textbook talks about Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards is one of the greatest examples of the Great Awakening. He was very prominent, very well educated, okay, super intelligent. He was very concerned about the way that Christians were beginning to behave and to kind of go along with the idea of the Great Awakening and really his very intelligent response to it. Remember now, he's very intelligent, he's very well educated, but he is part of this very emotional movement. And Jonathan Edwards, probably his most famous sermon was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And when he starts to really talk about sinners in the hands of an angry God, all right, he basically he tells the congregations that he's speaking at that God is so powerful, but is so angry with us that he dangles us over the pits of hell, held on by really just a spider's web, a string that keeps us from descending into the abyss. And that it is only really God's love that keeps us from being thrown into the pit. So there are, and Edwards wasn't really very sort of fire and brimstone. He would deliver this like a lecture, but the imagery that he used was terrifying to people. That you have this guy standing in front of you, basically telling you that your soul's survival depends on the grace shown to you by a very angry God about how we are behaving. And it was terrifying and very emotional. Okay. Others were very emotional orators. Okay. They would go out and they would preach and attract huge crowds. Okay. And so your textbook talks about a few of them. Okay. And people would come from all over to hear these guys preach. Okay. So Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is there. Okay. And he, it's just, you had so many people that use so many different techniques to try to appeal to religious emotionalism, and it worked very well. Okay, so one of the things that it did, okay, is it fractured some of the churches in America. Congregationalist churches, Presbyterian churches, okay. So some into old lights and new lights, okay. And so old lights were basically pre-Great Awakening, all right. New lights were those that had been brought into the church and had been brought up in the emotionalism of the church. And those two people wanted to very different. You still see this in many Protestant churches today. You have kind of the older people that like services one way, and you have the younger people who like more energetic, more modern services, and that tends and can split churches. And the Great Awakening did that. Okay. The Great Awakening, though, is, like we said, one of the most important movements early on that it really actually ends up uniting the colonies. Okay. Now, the other thing that I've talked about, and it's in the other lecture for from Wednesday, is the French arrival in America and the beginnings of the French and Indian War. I'm going to do a separate lecture and put that up, and it won't be long. It'll only be about 10 minutes or so about the French and Indian War, because I want you to get a good idea about what the war was about without having to really to kind of worry about seeing it or hearing it in class. Okay, I'm going to try to kind of give you a good idea, a good summary of what the war was about and why it's so important, because that's where we're going to stop. We're going to take our test, and then we're going to move on and talk about the American Revolution. All right,